Imagine this. The year is 1812. The most powerful man in the world, Napoleon Bonaparte, stands at the head of the largest European army ever assembled. 685,000 soldiers, the Grande Armée, a multinational force drawn from 20 nations, poised on the banks of the Niemen River. Their goal? To bring the vast Russian Empire and its stubborn Tsar Alexander I to heel. Napoleon was the master of Europe, a military genius who had redrawn the map of the continent. This invasion, he believed, would be his final crowning achievement, securing his dominion for a generation. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turns out, everything. This wasn't just a military campaign. It became one of history's most catastrophic and legendary disasters. A story of hubris, starvation, and the unforgiving Russian winter. How did the greatest army in the world simply vanish into the snow? Let's find out. So, why did Napoleon decide to invade Russia in the first place? It all boils down to a clash of empires and egos. A few years earlier, in 1807, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander had signed the treaties of Tilsit, seemingly becoming allies. A key part of this agreement was Russia joining the continental system. Napoleon's grand economic blockade designed to cripple his arch-nemesis Great Britain. By cutting off British trade with the continent, Napoleon hoped to bring the island nation to its knees without a direct invasion. But for Russia, this was economic suicide. Britain was a major trading partner, and the blockade was devastating the Russian economy. Under pressure from his own nobles, Tsar Alexander quietly reopened trade with Britain through neutral ships. For Napoleon, this was a direct betrayal. It was a challenge to his authority and a crack in the foundation of his European empire. He couldn't let it stand. He believed a quick, decisive war would force Russia back in line and reaffirm his dominance. He famously said, "I have come once and for all to finish with this colossus of the northern barbarians. The sword is now drawn. They must be pushed back into their ice." He expected a short campaign, maybe a few weeks, culminating in a single glorious battle where he would crush the Russian army, just as he had done so many times before against the Austrians and Prussians. But Russia wasn't Austria or Prussia. And Napoleon was about to learn that the hard way. In late June 1812, the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. It was a spectacular sight. A seemingly endless column of soldiers, cavalry and cannon stretching for miles. Napoleon's strategy was simple and had served him well for years. Seek out the enemy as main army, force a decisive battle, destroy it, and then dictate peace terms in their capital. He expected the Russians to stand and fight near the border. But the Russians had a different plan, one born of necessity. Their commanders, Barclay de Tolly and later Mikhail Kutuzov, knew they couldn't defeat Napoleon in a head-on collision. So they adopted a controversial and brutal strategy, scorched earth. As the French advanced, the Russian armies retreated, deeper and deeper into the vastness of Russia. And as they retreated, they burned everything in their path. They destroyed crops, torched villages, poisoned wells, and carried away any supplies that could be of use to the invaders. The Grande Armée, which was used to living off the land it conquered, found itself marching through a desolate, barren wasteland. The summer heat was oppressive, and dust choked the marching columns. Water was scarce and often contaminated, leading to outbreaks of dysentery and typhus that claimed tens of thousands of lives before a single major battle was fought. The supply lines, stretching hundreds of miles back to Poland and Germany, were struggling to keep up and were constantly harassed by Russian Cossacks. The great army was slowly being bled dry, not by Russian bullets, but by heat, disease, and starvation. Napoleon, frustrated, pushed his army harder and faster, desperate to catch the elusive Russians and force the battle he so desperately needed. Finally, on September 7th, near a small village called Borodino, about 70 miles west of Moscow, the Russians turned to fight. Tsar Alexander, under immense pressure to stop the retreat and defend Moscow, had ordered his army to make a stand. The resulting Battle of Borodino was one of the single bloodiest days in the history of warfare up to that point. Over 250,000 men clashed in a brutal, head-on slugging match. Napoleon threw his columns against the heavily fortified Russian positions, known as redoubts. The fighting was ferocious, a chaotic storm of cannon fire, musket volleys, and bayonet charges. At the end of the day, the French had captured the battlefield, but at a horrific cost. They suffered around 35,000 casualties. The Russians lost even more, perhaps 45,000 men. But here's the crucial difference. The Russian army, though battered, was not destroyed. Under the cover of darkness, Kutuzov's army disengaged and retreated in good order, leaving Napoleon with a hollow victory. He had won the ground, but he hadn't destroyed the enemy. He hadn't won the war. A week later, Napoleon rode into Moscow, expecting to find a delegation of city leaders ready to surrender and offer him the keys to the city. Instead, he found a nearly deserted metropolis. The Russians had evacuated almost the entire population. And then the fires started. Set by Russian agents, fires broke out all over Moscow. For days, a great firestorm raged, consuming the city's wooden buildings. Over 3/4 of Moscow was destroyed. Napoleon had captured a capital, but it was a smoldering ruin, stripped of all supplies and offering no shelter for the coming winter. He sat in the Kremlin, surrounded by ashes, waiting for a peace offer from the Tsar that would never come. Alexander refused to negotiate. He declared, "Napoleon or me or Napoleon, but we cannot reign together." For 5 weeks Napoleon waited, his strategic situation growing more desperate by the day. His army was isolated, hundreds of miles deep in hostile territory, with its supply lines stretched to the breaking point and the dreaded Russian winter closing in. The first snowflakes began to fall. Napoleon finally realized his gamble had failed. On October 19th, he gave the order that sealed his army's fate. The Grande Army would retreat from Moscow. The retreat was a descent into hell. Napoleon initially tried to take a more southerly route, through unspoiled territory where they might find food. But a resurgent Russian army blocked his path, forcing him back onto the same scorched, devastated road they had taken on the advance. Now, the full fury of General Winter was unleashed. Temperatures plummeted to -20, -30, even -40 degrees Celsius. The soldiers, still wearing their summer uniforms, had no proper winter clothing. They wrapped themselves in rags, furs stripped from the dead, anything to stay warm. Food ran out completely. Men slaughtered their own horses for meat, drinking their blood to survive. Starvation and hypothermia became the main killers. The once mighty Grande Army dissolved into a desperate, straggling column of ghosts, haunted by swarms of Cossack cavalry and Russian partisans who picked off stragglers and small groups. Discipline collapsed. Men abandoned their weapons, their comrades, their humanity, all for a crust of bread or a chance to get closer to a pitiful fire. The road back was littered with the frozen corpses of men and horses, abandoned cannons, and wagons filled with loot from Moscow that was now worthless. It was a trail of death stretching for hundreds of miles. The final nightmarish chapter of the retreat came at the Berezina River. The Russians had destroyed the main bridges, trapping the remnants of Napoleon's army. It seemed like the end. But in a final display of genius and courage, Napoleon's Dutch engineers worked in the freezing water, building 2 makeshift pontoon bridges. For 3 days, a desperate stream of soldiers and terrified civilian camp followers tried to cross while the Russian army closed in, bombarding the bridges with artillery. The scenes were horrific. Men, women, and children were crushed in the stampede, pushed into the icy river, or struck down by cannonballs. The engineers who built the bridges were the last to cross, and they had to set them on fire to prevent the pursuing Russians from abandoning thousands of their own comrades on the far bank to be killed or captured. It was a heroic feat of engineering, but a human tragedy of epic proportions. Of the roughly 50,000 who reached the Berezina, perhaps only 25,000 made it across. Finally, in mid-December, the few thousand survivors stumbled back across the Niemen River out of Russia. Of the 685,000 men who had entered, fewer than 40,000 combat-effective soldiers returned. Hundreds of thousands were dead, and over 100,000 were prisoners. The Grande Armée had ceased to exist. The 1812 campaign was an unmitigated disaster that marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon. The myth of his invincibility was shattered. The catastrophic loss of trained soldiers, and crucially horses, was something his empire could never fully recover from. Encouraged by his defeat, the nations of Europe, Prussia, Austria, Sweden rose up and joined Russia and Britain in a new coalition against him. The war would rage on for another 2 years, but Napoleon was now fighting a defensive war on multiple fronts. The road from Moscow led directly to his defeat at Leipzig in 1813 and ultimately to his first abdication and exile in 1814. The 1812 invasion of Russia stands as a powerful and terrifying lesson in history, a story of how overconfidence, a failure to understand the environment, and the sheer resilience of a nation can bring down even the mightiest of empires. It's a testament to the brutal reality of war, far removed from the glory of parades and portraits. Thank you so much for watching. This is one of the most dramatic stories in all of military history, and there's so much more to explore. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most pivotal moments. Let me know in the comments what historical event you'd like to see covered next. See you in the next video.